Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in this Wednesday afternoon. We'd like to thank Laura Afonso and all of her food and drink guests at the 3 o'clock hour. And we'd like to thank Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia from switching from Tuesday to Wednesday to talk politics and news. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Well, I think it was a little fortuitous that we switched your day this week, considering the big news around the country, of course, was President Donald Trump's address directly to the American people last night on immigration and his border security plan. Now, of course, there were high-level talks at the White House today, but let's backtrack to the response to this kind of unprecedented appeal, a very political one, straight to the American people.
Right. When Donald Trump spent 8 or 9 minutes last night speaking to the American people during prime time, and then Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer responded, that is not the norm. Usually when presidents take to the Oval Office and make a speech like that, it's because there is an actual imminent national emergency or a severe threat. So when the United States managed to assassinate Osama bin Laden, Barack Obama spoke to the Oval Office. When we've been on the brink of war, other presidents have done the same thing. To make an explicitly political plea for a policy that's not very popular right now, either in Congress or with the American people, is probably using that position in a way that most people think is inappropriate. And that's what the president did last night.
Do you think it sets a dangerous precedent? Do you think perhaps a different administration might go maybe back to the norm and say that's really sort of outside the confines of what's expected from the office of the president?
I think most people believe that it's outside the confines of the office, but the reason I'm not necessarily convinced that it's going to set a bad precedent is because it was not effective. It doesn't matter who you ask. It's unlikely that anybody last night who already supported the president felt more energized based on that speech. And it's completely the case that people who were already opposed were certainly not swayed. So this might be one of those situations where the president ultimately realizes that this is not an effective way to communicate. It's not a campaign rally. It's not something where he can really motivate his base, because this is also a terrible atmosphere for him. He's not very compelling when delivering remarks this way.
So do you think we'll go back to see communication via a Twitter, perhaps?
Well, we're already seeing communications via Twitter about how today's meetings with Pelosi and Schumer were a disaster. That allows the president to, I think, speak in a language that's more comfortable for him. And it also allows him to be a bit more provocative because he's not actually sitting in such an austere environment, and people aren't juxtaposing him to other presidents who have sat in that very position.
And, you know, as difficult as the optics might have been for the president, let's talk about the optics of the response from Democratic leadership. It seemed, again, social media just erupted simply of the visuals of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the way they were standing next to each other, the way their makeup was, the way the lighting was, the comparisons to SNL. I mean, did their response get completely lost in the visual?
Right. And frankly, again, I don't think it matters, because the response is only relevant if the initial message is really important, and it wasn't compelling. I also don't think that Pelosi or Schumer underperformed in any way. They looked a little strange, but at the end of the day, we saw that there was no distance between the two of them or physical distance between the two of them, it turns out, when it comes to their positions on immigration or what the Democrats in either chamber are going to do. I think it was also important that they took that time and they presented a united front, because these are the people that are going to be paving the way for 2020, and they're the ones who are going to be shaping the Democratic Party's messages. So this was the first opportunity for the American people to see the two parties go head to head. And frankly, neither was particularly compelling, but I think it was really the president's night to lose, and he did.
And we'll talk, just the response from Schumer and Pelosi, directly after the president's address. I have to imagine all those remarks were pre-written. There weren't actually anything that was directly in response to what the president said that evening.
That's right. That's just like the State of the Union address every year also. The person selected to do the response to the State of the Union address knows well ahead of time that he or she is going to be making a speech, and that speech needs to be written and vetted well before we know what the president is actually going to say. But the important thing last night was that the president was trying to suggest that we have this national emergency and we have this set of circumstances that are creating a humanitarian crisis, and as a result, the government cannot be reopened until we're willing to deal with it. What Schumer and Pelosi were trying to point out is that immigration reform and the government shutdown in no way, shape, or form need to be linked, and this president should be held accountable for a false linkage.
So any light at the end of this tunnel, as you said, the president returning to his favorite platform of Twitter to talk about today's meetings at the White House not going so well. I mean, what's the talk inside the Beltway about the possibility of ending the shutdown?
I think the general sense is that the shutdown is going to end when enough Republicans make it clear that they can't back this anymore. And it's not only the Republicans that are ultimately going to be running for re-election in 2020, it's also a bunch of Republicans in the Senate in particular who have in the past been willing to move towards some sort of more meaningful immigration reform. The other reason that I think today's meetings didn't work out that well for the president is because his tweet indicated that the meetings were not effective because they said that even if he opens the government right now, they're not going to give him all of the money for his wall. Right, that's exactly the point. That's why the government's shut down. So that's not a compromise. That's not him going in and trying to cut a deal. That's just changing the date of money delivery. So, I'm not surprised. I think that a lot of Republicans might look around and say, wait a minute, this guy is the best negotiator. He went in and asked nothing different than what he had asked last night or last week or even last month.
So I think you raised the point that we'll all be watching moving forward, as you said, the Republicans that might move their support for the president on this, again, to see a potential end to the shutdown. Of course, we've seen stories about folks who've been impacted by it, the lack of paychecks last week as well. Do you think those stories and that really resonates with the American people who might not personally be waiting on a paycheck from the federal government or government services?
I think so, in a more indirect way. So people that are trying to travel are going to continue to run up against problems if TSA workers continue to have sick outs. People that are trying to get clinical trials from the NIH are going to run into problems when they try to access that information. People who are expecting filing their tax returns and expecting refunds from the government are going to be sadly surprised when there's more of a delay than usual, or if you're trying to get a passport or any of these other things. So, we've long known that people navigate government and interact with the political system in dozens of ways, even on a weekly basis. Most people don't realize that so many of their actions involve the government. And so slowly but surely, and by slowly I mean over the course of the next couple of weeks, it's probably going to be clear to a lot of people, even if they're not government workers or even if they're not trying to visit national parks, that this is having an effect.
So let's talk about some other news that probably wasn't actually big news, but probably speculated all along, the announcement of the impending departure of Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Does this come as a surprise to anyone?
It doesn't. I think the more surprising piece of information is that he's held on as long as he has. You might recall it was about a month ago or 6 weeks ago when he was summoned to the White House and everybody thought he was being terminated that day. And now it looks like he's actually leaving on his own time schedule. Although we've also seen in the past that when people announce their intention to leave, the president expedites that timeline and then claims that he fired the person. So by tomorrow, this could be a completely different narrative. But as of right now, this seems like a much more amicable departure than we might have expected.
And so with the Democratic control of the House, there's been some talk about revisiting some legislation for protections for Special Investigator Mueller. Do we think that this has any potential?
What's tricky here is that the only way that a Republican-controlled Senate is going to pass legislation like that is if there really seems to be an imminent threat. And the White House has stopped short of doing that. So, I think they're walking a fine line, and it's tricky, but at this point, I just don't see enough Republicans in the Senate getting on board to protect the special counsel because it's more hypothetical than necessary. Now, enough of them are on the record saying that if the White House moves to fire him, they need to be stopped.
Okay.
And so if there's an actual act moving in that direction, you might be able to get that level of support.
So one final topic I do want to discuss, you've been quoted in the national press on this, comparisons between Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton. Simply on the female basis, two women running for president, you certainly had a lot to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think it's tricky to be a woman running for president, and not because voters won't vote for you or donors won't give to you or the media won't treat you fairly, but because it's still so novel to see a female presidential candidate that the first thing that people are going to think about is, well, how do you compare to Hillary Clinton? And in Elizabeth Warren's case, a lot of the comparisons, whether fair or not, have to do with Clinton's more negative traits. She was seen as not necessarily authentic. She was seen as over-prepared. She was seen as somebody who was really, really interested in climbing that career ladder and cracking that glass ceiling. And people weren't really sure what to do with that. And I think that we're already seeing those kinds of comparisons to Warren. There's also this general sense, I think most importantly, that both are somewhat unlikable. And the reason I'm a little bit skeptical about those kinds of comparisons, though, is because Elizabeth Warren has actually given a lot of Republicans and a lot of people who are not necessarily that excited about a very progressive agenda, reasons to find her unlikable. She's been an outspoken critic of Donald Trump since day one. Other more unknown entities, whether they be Kamala Harris or Amy Klobuchar, haven't already gained that kind of national recognition as a thorn in the president's side. And so I would say that before we should come down on the side of, oh my gosh, the American public is incredibly sexist and they're never going to elect a woman, we should see how they react to some of these other women whose narratives haven't necessarily already been written or crafted in direct comparison to President Trump. So, I think we're going to have multiple female candidates emerge this time around, so we'll be well prepared to have this conversation about sexism in American politics. I don't think that Warren is necessarily the best case study, just like Hillary Clinton certainly was not either.
Speaking of case studies, looking at presidential candidates coming out of Massachusetts in recent years.
Yeah, didn't work out so well.
I mean, is that sort of a prophecy in and of itself? I mean, is that a detriment for Warren given the track record of recent presidential of Massachusetts candidates?
I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to imagine any other Republican in 2012 defeating Barack Obama. I don't think it was because Mitt Romney was from Massachusetts. It's hard to imagine Michael Dukakis being any more ineffective as a presidential candidate in 1988. I don't think it's because he was from Massachusetts. So I also think we've gotten to a point now where it's not necessary for you to win your home state. It used to be, right? If you would lose your home state, that would be seen as completely unbelievable. When Al Gore didn't win Tennessee, that was seen as sort of, a perfect example of why he maybe shouldn't have been elected. The idea that Donald Trump would have won New York never even occurred to anybody. So, I think we've moved away from that and we're thinking about politics more nationally now.
Speaking of national politics, I know it's come up before, but now, of course, we are in 2019 with 2020 is going to be around the corner. Governor Gina Raimondo is the head of the Democratic Governors Association. Could you see her being a VP potential for a candidate in 2020?
She's definitely on a short list. The vice presidential selection is tricky because we tend to think we know what people are looking for, and then it turns out that we actually don't, right? And a lot of it is contingent on who the presidential candidate is. So some people want a candidate who can deliver a state that otherwise wouldn't go in that candidate's column. It's hard to imagine that Gina Raimondo would help deliver Rhode Island to a Democrat. Regardless, wouldn't help, but anybody is going to deliver Rhode Island to a Democrat. So there's not added value. Added value in terms of diversity on the ticket could obviously be an advantage to her. A governor is also a good path to the presidency. But, I think it's really too soon to tell, and a lot depends on the chemistry between the nominee and the shortlist people.
Well, a lot to look forward to in 2019, but as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, looking to see which Republicans, again, might not back President Donald Trump in his digging in his heels on his request for money for a border wall as the government shutdown does continue. So Jennifer Lawless, we look forward to catching up with you soon, and we wish you all the best starting the new semester down at the University of Virginia.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Don't go anywhere. We're going to go from politics to literature here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We'll be right back.